Hello and welcome to the live class continuing education series presented by the American Council on Exercise. My name is Jackie Crockford and I will be your host for our presentation today, a science-based blueprint for creating inclusive yoga classes. Hi, I am joined with Jessica Matthews today. She is one of our senior advisors at the American Council on Exercise. Jessica, thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me.
So tell us a little bit about yourself and a little bit about what we're going to be talking to our viewers about today.
Absolutely. So as you mentioned, I have had the pleasure of working with ACE for a number of years now. I've worked for the last 16 years in the health and fitness space, teaching group fitness classes, personal training, and of course yoga being a big part of what I do. Today, really, I look at this as sort of the merging of how my brain operates, which is part exercise physiologist, part yoga teacher and yoga student. So we're really going to talk about how do we, as yoga teachers or fitness professionals, how do we create inclusive yoga classes that really do bring some of the science to life through the physical practice of yoga.
Great, and that's perfect. We have a model with us today.
Yes.
Irene will be joining us in a little while, so you will be able to visually see these demonstrations.
Absolutely.
So it will be great. And just as a reminder, for those of you that are joining us, thank you for taking the time out. You are watching for free via our YouTube channel. So if you would like to comment in, if you are having technical issues, or if you have a question for Jessica that comes up today during the presentation, please type that into the chat box along the right-hand side of your screen. Also, if you would like to receive CECs, you can do that by purchasing with the link that is provided below in the course description. So I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to you, Jessica, and let's start talking about some yoga and incorporating that into our class blueprint.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Jackie. Appreciate that. Isn't she awesome? As I mentioned and Jackie has shared, thank you so much for being here. Again, this is a topic that I'm really excited to share with you. My intention today is to give you lots of practical tools that you can use to enhance your classes or the work that maybe you do with your clients. So it must be the educator in me. My full-time job is I am a college professor. I always think it's good to just start by what I consider managing expectations, which is just a friendly reminder of what it is you signed up for today and what it is that I promise to deliver to you in this educational experience. So what you see on the screen right now is the same thing you saw when you signed up for this class. So a couple of key things. This will be sort of our roadmap, if you will, for our class today. The first thing we'll do is we're going to talk about how to apply these human movement principles to our asana or our yoga pose selection. We're also going to look at how then can we kind of manipulate the variables, if you will, for various poses to be able to create an inclusive class experience. That means how do we, as yoga teachers or fitness professionals, how do we tailor the experience to meet our students where they are on that particular day? In addition, we'll talk about just at a high level designing an intelligent sequence for a yoga class, specifically looking at vinyasa style classes, so more of that breath synchronized movement. So that's a little lay of the land, if you will, for our class today. And I did feel compelled, the yoga teacher in me and also the yoga student in me felt compelled to kind of open our discussion today by addressing the fact that we are really focusing on the physical practice of yoga. So that by no means means that any of the other aspects of yoga are not important. But our focus today is really on the physical side. So if we refer to the Yoga Sutras of Patanjali, we know there's 8 limbs of yoga. We are focusing on the third limb, the asanas, or what we've come to know as the poses. But again, what we should really take away from this is when we discuss the physical aspects of yoga, it's not detracting from the other aspects. In fact, if we look to that same historic text, the Yoga Sutras, one of the things the sutras suggest is that in order for prana, energy or life force, to move freely through the body, through our energy channels or the nadis, we must cultivate steadiness in the physical body. And that's really what we do through our yoga practice. We help our students to find that steadiness and comfort, both in their physical body as well as their mind and their spirit. So I felt compelled, even though we're talking about the physical, and you see some photos perhaps now up on the screen of me teaching yoga classes in different settings, we are certainly not saying that the other aspects of yoga aren't important. Also, what's important to note, and you see represented in some of these visual images, when we're teaching yoga classes or teaching group fitness classes, we're teaching a lot of different students all at once. And remember, each day our students have different needs. So that's a key reason why we're going to spend some time looking at what variables can we manipulate in order to create regressions and progressions of physical postures in order to best serve our students. That's a key thing that was said by Krishnamacharya. Some of you may be familiar with who's kind of credited as the father of modern day Hatha yoga. What he suggested and what was carried on through his work of his son Desikachar is that the yoga practice should be tailored to the student. So that means the burden, if you will, is on us as yoga teachers, as fitness professionals, to make sure we're creating those inclusive experiences. So to get off my soapbox for a minute, I promised that we would start by talking about the principles of human movement. So I always ask this question. Anytime I'm sharing information in a class setting or I'm learning something myself, I always ask myself why. And I'll encourage you through this experience today as we learn new information or maybe refresh on some topics you might be already somewhat familiar with. Always ask yourself why. What does this mean for my teaching and how ultimately does this serve my students? So let's look at asana, the physical poses as we've come to know them. Let's look at how an understanding of human movement can help us in terms of deciding what poses we may want to include in the class, how we can vary those poses, and then also how we can ultimately pull them together into an intelligently sequenced class design. So what you're going to see come up on the screen is two different terms, and I'd love for us to be familiar with these terms just so that we're speaking the same language. The overarching theme, first and foremost, is really how do we take what we do on our mat? So again, we're talking the physical practice, though this does apply to the other aspects of yoga too. But how do we take what we learn on our mats and how do we translate that into everyday life? So with that being said, we'll take this kind of functional approach to looking at asana, and it's important we know those two key terms. The terms that you see listed on the screen are joint stability and joint mobility. So joint stability referring to a joint's ability to kind of control or maintain a position with very little or no movement. And then also joint mobility, kind of the other end of the spectrum, which is a joint's ability to move through an uninhibited range of motion, and to do that within kind of the constructs of the range of motion that joint is designed to have. So we know different joints in the body possess different ranges of motion. An important disclaimer that I feel compelled to tell you is that even as we journey forward and we look at kind of the main role or job certain joints are assigned to do, meaning are they designed to be mostly stable or are they designed to be primarily mobile, what's important to know is there's not an absolute, meaning a joint, even though it might favor mobility, it doesn't mean that there's never points in time where it's not designed to also be stable. So just keep that in mind too as we go through the remainder of this kind of time together. Just know that certain joints have a primary job or designation, and it's important that we know this. Go back to that question. Why do we want to know this as yoga teachers? Well, one of the most important things is, remember, if what we do on our mats should translate to how we move off of our mats, we should have an understanding that really the body, the physical body, is one interconnected being. We know that between body, mind, and spirit, but also within the body physically itself. So what we'll look at now, I'm going to put a graphic up on the screen for you to see, is this concept of the body as a kinetic chain. So if you see the image right now, do this for me. Without getting into the nitty-gritty quite yet, start from the bottom. This is always a framework I will offer that's very helpful. Always look from your foundation up. Great when we're talking about looking at posture, alignment, when we're talking about looking at movements or asana. But start from the bottom, work your way up. Tell me what pattern it is that you see. And I'll just pretend that I can read your mind. What you're probably seeing the pattern is that it alternates from the ground up, this alternating pattern of joint stability and joint mobility. So as we go through some of those major joints in the body, what you're seeing is that alternating pattern. Now this, my friends, this is by design. This is looking at the body's architecture. So some of you who are yoga teachers, fitness professionals already, you've probably learned and have great knowledge of the muscles, the joint actions, the planes of motion, which we'll talk about. But what also is important to kind of take note of is these primary roles or responsibilities of the joints. So what do I mean by that? There's 4 key areas that I really want to bring your attention to, and you'll see this again if we look at the graphic that's up on the screen. 4 key areas of the body that are designed primarily to be mobile. And starting again, our system of looking from the ground up, One of the key areas you see designed to be mobile is the ankles. So right now, wherever you are, hopefully in your place, that you can just start to move your ankles. And you'll notice there's a great deal of motion, range of motion at that joint. It's designed to be mobile. Other areas of the body that are designed to be mobile are the hips, a great ball and socket joint designed to be mobile. Thoracic spine, the upper mid part of the back, that also is designed to be mobile. So when we think about using your knowledge perhaps of the planes of motion, we know when we rotate, that primarily is happening at the thoracic spine, that upper back. Also, another key area designed to be mobile is what you see labeled as the glenohumeral joint or the shoulder joint. So again, another great ball and socket joint. So we start to see by architectural design what's the intended design of our body and as it relates to movement, and this applies to asana, yoga poses, we see that there's certain areas that are designed to move. This then allows other areas of the body. A key one I want to hone in on is the lumbar spine, the low back, an area that many people experience discomfort, pain in their lifetime. What's important is that area really during movement, it's designed to be stable. It's not designed to move a ton. What you'll notice is what it's surrounded by, the thoracic spine above, the hips below, they're designed to be mobile. So we see that if each kind of area of the body is able to perform its job function effectively, we have good quality movement, not just on our yoga mats, but also off of our yoga mats. And that's the theme that I want to carry through in this discussion and application of human movement. So now that we have an understanding of the framework, if you will, right? So I'm looking at this almost an analogy like we're building a house together. Now that we've got this foundation, we understand joint stability and mobility. Now what can we do with that? And one thing we can do, maybe this is a way to look at it, is another lens to look at human movement and to look at yoga poses. So we can look at movement now in terms of our primary movement patterns. What are the things we do day in and day out as human beings, and how can we kind of classify or categorize those movements? Now, I will tell you this, that sometimes you'll see different models that talk about the 5 primary movement patterns. Sometimes there's a 6 model, an 8-dimension model of the movement patterns. We're looking at 5 specifically today. No right or wrong, just a different way to categorize and look at movement. So what you see on the screen, I'm going to direct your attention there now, is you see the 5 primary movement patterns. You're welcome to note those down. And what you see also are yoga examples tied to each one. What I want to do is layer on, right, give us another perspective and just talk about how this translates to our movements in everyday life. So the first one you see is a bend and lift pattern, also known as a hip hinging movement, or what many of us might think of as a squat. My fitness folks, we think squats, deadlifts, but that bend and lift hip hinging movement. The photo that you see up on the screen is of a yoga pose, might look very familiar to many of you, which is chair pose Utkatasana. So we have that hip hinge, that bend and lift movement. Now we do that movement pattern in everyday life. When you sit down and rise up out of a chair, when you bend down to pick up a heavy bag or box off the floor, when you bend down to pick up your children, your grandchildren, you are performing a bend and lift movement. So we start to see, again, that transference. That's a word you'll hear me continue to use. How does what we do on our mat translate to how we then move better and have a better quality of life off of our mat? The next thing that you see up on the screen, our second movement pattern, is a single leg movement pattern. Also, many of us think of this as a lunging or perhaps a single leg balance like you see on the screen, a variation on tree pose, Vrikshasana. Now, when do we do a single leg pattern in life? Every time you walk. Your gait, your movement pattern when you're walking is a single leg movement pattern. Also perhaps when you're climbing up a flight of stairs, single leg movement pattern. And we can look at other examples in yoga, and you'll see those when we get into the demonstration where I'll invite Irene to join me, where we have poses like crescent lunge on Janayasana, and again an example of another single leg movement pattern in addition to our balancing poses. The next 2 movement patterns that you see, I'm going to pool those together. That's pushing and pulling movements. So one of the most common that we can think of from a yogic perspective is the performing of 4-limb staff pose or Chaturanga Dandasana, kind of that low push-up position, if you will. What we know in fitness, we think about movements like push-ups, for example. When we think of pulling movements, we might think in fitness, we think of pull-ups. But we think about, this is where some of your anatomy knowledge will be really helpful, we think about almost these muscles that act in opposition on a particular joint. So our agonists and those antagonists, and then how that ultimately creates balanced movement in the body. So what's important for us to think about from these pushing and pulling movements is, again, the transference. How does this tie in to what we do in everyday life? When you push yourself up from a lying position to a seated position when you get out of bed, when you're pushing open the door at your favorite store, or maybe pulling open your car door to get in, or pushing a stroller or a grocery cart, you are doing those pushing and pulling movements. Last but not least, the last one you'll see up on the screen, our fifth primary movement pattern, is rotational movements. So tying into our three planes of motion once again, we have movement in the transverse plane, those rotations. In yoga, we think of our twisting postures, right? And there's many out there to think about, maybe something like half Lord of the Fishes, that seated twisting posture. In life, we do this all the time. Hopefully every time you get in a car, you're putting on your seatbelt. You're performing a rotational movement. Again, my intention, the lens that I want to bring to our discussion today is how does what we do on our mat translate to how we move off of our mat. And if we always apply this to our yoga teaching, whether it be the physical as we're talking today, or whether it be some of the other aspects, we should always think about what's the transference of this information. So now we're speaking the same language a little bit, I hope. And I hope this information was helpful for you to just start thinking about the practice of postures in a little different way. Now that we have a similar framework to work from, I want us to start to consider how do we now get to tailoring those inclusive experiences. This is important. So how do we, again, do the work that Krishnamacharya and his son Desikachar say? How do we tailor the practice to meet our students? It's our job to do that. And there's ways that you can do that, even if some of you right now are saying, but at one time I might be teaching 20 people, 40 people, 400 people. How do I tailor the experience? And I promise to give you some tools that will help you to do just that. Before we move on, again, it must be the teacher in me. I love a couple definitions just so, again, we're speaking the same language. So our theme for this is how do we create inclusive experiences that are tailor-made to each student. Two words that I'd like you to know, you see those up on the screen right now, are regressions and progressions. So a regression, in this case of a yoga pose, will be a way that we can decrease the complexity or the intensity of a particular movement or an asana. On the flip side, a progression will be how can we increase the complexity or the intensity of that particular movement. Now, what is important to note is not only, okay, how do we know that from a science perspective? How do we actually create regressions and progressions of poses? Sometimes it might mean offering an entirely different pose. Here's a good example. Maybe in a class you're teaching upward facing dog, and maybe you'll like to give the option for someone they can perform a low cobra pose. So we could give a whole different pose, but what if we're trying to create this kind of succinct experience together where we want to be able to tailor, just make some little tweaks of variables so we can meet students where they are. If that's the case, we're going to look at different ways we can change those variables, base of support, the lever length, all the things that in just a moment I'll invite Irene to join me to show you. But what is important to note is that I don't specifically announce in my class, part of this inclusive experience, I don't say for a regression or to make this easier. I really think about my language choices. This is important work that we do as yoga teachers, as group fitness instructors, as personal trainers. We don't want to label people. We want to, in essence, label the movement and be able to scale the movement itself. So for example, in just a moment, you'll hear me actually give some great verbal cues of how I would introduce these variables or these progressions and regressions. We just simply won't call them that. You also won't hear me personally say things like beginner, intermediate, and advanced. Again, I like to look at what's happening in the movement. That's the science brain. That's the exercise physiologist in me. I look at how can I tailor the movement and create an experience where everyone feels welcomed, where everyone feels included, and where I can cultivate that steadiness and comfort, satira and sukham in the body. That's really important to me. So with those definitions in mind, I am going to invite Irene to come out and join me. So I have to tell you this little bit about Irene. Irene is actually an ACE certified personal trainer. Irene is also one of my yoga teacher training graduates, and she herself is a yoga teacher. So I thought how perfect to have her join me today. Thanks for being here, Irene. So I want to direct your attention just for a moment to the screen. So when I mentioned those variables, so how do we manipulate, if you will, these postures, and what can we do to create either more intensity, more sensation, more exploration, or what can we do to create more steadiness, comfort, and support? So we're going to look at each of these variables. The first one being base of support. So what I'm going to have Irene do is actually come into chair pose Utkatasana. So if you don't mind, Irene, you're going to see her bring her feet all the way together until the big toes touch. Commonly, this pose is taught with this foot placement. When Irene's ready, she's going to perform that bend and lift, that hip hinging movement. She'll hinge the hips, bend the knees, and she's going to come into a deeper expression, reaching the arms up. Now, I want to direct your attention specifically to her feet. We're talking base of support. So what is happening here? In this expression, I might be teaching it with the feet together. Now, if I wanted to create more accessibility, and I'm teaching this in a class, I could say to my students, like Irene, for more support, for more comfort and accessibility, perhaps part the feet hip width distance apart today. And notice then my students, in this case Irene, can take that cue to come to a wider base of support. Those of you familiar with balance training, wider base of support is going to equal more stability in a pose. And nice and easy, Irene, you can rise up and relax. Thank you for that demonstration. Now, you saw that's how we can look at base of support. There was something else Irene was doing, and just the teacher and me wanted to say it, but I focused one topic at a time. We could have also looked at lever length. So you saw in that particular pose, Irene's arms were straight up, and I could have adjusted the lever length by giving some variations. But let me show you that particular topic with a different pose, just so we can see how this applies to different asana. So what I'm going to invite Irene to do now is to come into extended side angle pose. So she's going to bring her right foot forward. And you'll see I'm not really cueing through alignment. That's why I have a great seasoned student like Irene here with me today. My focus is to talk about the variables. How do we manipulate the intensity and the complexity? So she's coming into extended side angle. And when she's there, what we're going to look at is what you see noted as number 2 up on the screen, which is the lever length. What do I mean by lever length? I mean what's happening with her arms or her legs. In this case, I'm looking just at the arms for a moment. What is she doing, and how could I either create a regression or a progression? So you see here, Irene is in a progressed version of the pose. She's reaching the arm up and over. Now, one option, I could have kind of a mediary option. Irene, reach your arm, your top left arm, straight up to the sky. So now the palm is facing towards you. This might be a place where I want to start this pose, because then I could do the progression option. Irene, go back to where you just were. So this could be a progression option. Here's another thing. I have a block handy. Maybe I'm using props. If Irene wanted to move to another progression, maybe she extends the bottom arm as well. So now we're seeing longer levers equals a bit more intensity. So I could say something like, for more sensation, for more exploration in a pose, and she can explore. Now, before she gets too tired, Irene, I'm going to have you come back up, forearm on your right thigh, and the left arm straight up. Now, if I wanted to create a regression of this pose, I could shorten this lever. That means I can take the top hand and invite Irene to place it on her left hip. Remember, my intention here is to really focus on building that core strength, the strength of her lower body, and I want the body to be open to the side in this particular pose. So shortening the lever might make it more accessible. And Irene, when you're ready, you can go ahead and stand up. Thank you so much. And I'll just move the block off to the side. So that's one way we can look at lever length in a standing posture like extended side angle. And that applies, if you think about it, like another pose, perhaps Utthita Trikonasana, extended triangle pose. I am going to invite Irene to actually come down to the ground when she's ready to show you another way that we can change the lever length in a pose. So as we come down to a seated position, we're going to actually look at Navasana boat pose. So I'm going to invite Irene to actually start with the knees bent and the feet flat on the floor. And if I direct your attention to the screen for a minute, you actually see this variation of boat pose shown on your screen right now. But Irene's going to show us that in real life, because what's better than having our real life model show us? So Irene, when you're ready, I'll invite you to hold the backs of your thighs and then find balance and nice and easy lift one foot and then the other. So again, let's look at levers. That's what we're talking about here, the lever length. So if she keeps the knees bent, we have a shorter lever now, and she's holding the hands on the thighs for even additional support. But what if I want to work Irene towards more of a fuller expression, full boat pose? Well, Irene, when she feels ready, can keep the hands where they are and maybe just start to lengthen the lever. She can start to extend the legs. If she's feeling really adventurous, I'll put her right on the spot. Maybe she releases the legs and reaches the arms straight out. Beautiful. Another option, she could even raise the arms overhead. Longer lever, and now she's raising her center of gravity as well. So we see the science blueprint. Go ahead and relax for me, Irene. Thank you so much, and you can just be comfortable. So we see how we can manipulate lever length, creating progressions and regressions of postures. The next thing I'd like to direct your attention to that you see on the screen is the number 3 bullet. And this specifically focuses on our positioning of the body against gravity. What do I mean by that? Irene, could you extend your legs out in front of you? Irene's going to get situated for me. So when we talk about how we can position the body against gravity to either create more accessibility or maybe to create a little more intensity, we have to think about how does gravity move the body. I want to give an example with 2 different forward folds. So Irene, since she's already seated, is going to do seated forward fold Paschimottanasana. So Irene, when you're ready, and be sensitive, Irene just kind of joined me, so she might not be totally warm yet, but she's just going to show a seated version of a forward fold. So in this position, we do not have the most advantage of gravity. So that means this is going to be a more intense posture for our students when we talk about a way that we can lengthen the hamstrings, right? One of the key intentions with this pose. So something for us to think about when we get into sequencing, this probably is not going to be a pose I want to visit too early on in a class. So I want to think, how could I produce the same effect in the body, but how can I use gravity's assistance to help me do that? Irene, go ahead and come out of the pose. Sit up nice and tall. And when Irene's ready, I'm actually going to invite her to come back up to a standing position. If you could actually pass through downward facing dog, that'll be great. Give her a little time to transition. I'm going to stand up. So we looked at a seated forward fold where we don't have the advantage of gravity. Irene's going to do this for me now, right from downward facing dog. Cool little trick. She's going to walk the hands right back towards her feet. She's going to come into Uttanasana forward fold. She can have a soft bend or a deep bend in the knees and just lets the body fold in half. Notice now I'm using the advantage of gravity. So this, for some of you who think, in my yoga classes, why do I tend to teach something like a standing forward fold before I move into something like a seated forward fold, is you're using the advantage of gravity. Isn't it cool to know the science behind things? I love to know the why. Always ask yourself questions when you're designing a yoga class or incorporating yoga poses into your sessions with your clients or other group fitness classes. What is the why? Why am I doing this? So we see now Irene's body positioned in a way that gravity is able to help to facilitate this particular pose and that stretching that we talked about for the hamstrings in the body. So now Irene, when you're ready, go ahead and just slowly stand up. Take your time. As Irene starts to stand up, I'm going to direct your attention back to the screen. So what you see as number 4 is the direction of movement. So this might throw us through a little bit of a loop as yoga teachers because so often we think about everything happening from the front of our mat. But now let's think about, go back to that, what we do on the mat, how does it apply off the mat? Think about how do we tend to move mostly through life? It's forward. We tend to move forward. Do we move backwards sometimes? Sure. But for the most part, when we're walking our normal gait, we're heading forward. This might be something for us to consider when we're introducing certain yoga poses into our practice. Maybe we want to introduce a pose like crescent lunge, which I'm going to have Irene do now. She's going to take her hands to the hips. Notice she's towards the back edge of her mat. Irene, when you're ready, step your right foot forward. So she takes this initial step forward, and then when you're ready, bend at the knee. And you can also release the back knee to the ground. So the heel's lifted, and then she'll soften the knee to the ground. So notice one way to come into this posture, which might be a staple pose in many of your classes, she can do that also from the back edge of her mat. This can be a great way to start to kind of train that neuromuscular efficiency to say, normally in life, my body's accustomed to moving forward. And in fact, coming into this pose for the first time, I can explore it in the same way. Does it work to go from the front of the mat backwards? Sure, we'll see that right now too. Irene, could you do this for me? Little bit of a trick here. Will you tuck your back left toes under? Lift your knee up. And with the hands at the hips, take a step forward to the top of your mat. Little single leg balance here, We see our 5 primary movement patterns. Now I just want to show, just for purposes, Irene, can you keep your weight in your left foot and step your right foot back? So she's going to come into that same crescent lunge, and she's going to release the back right knee now to the ground. So there's a reason that I wanted her to do this on both sides. Well, one, it's nice to balance the body, right? Of course, as yoga teachers, group fitness instructors, we're going to create symmetry when we're exploring asymmetrical poses. But there's another reason too. I'm directing your attention now to the 5th bullet you see on the screen, which is the number of contact points. So notice for crescent lunge and this low version of a lunge, I'm going to direct your attention to Irene's knee. Notice that Irene's knee is touching the ground. She has more contact points in this posture. That means more support, accessibility, and stability. These are all great, juicy words that I use when I'm explaining this to my students. If that's what I'm seeking in my practice today, that's what serves me and my body best, that's what I should be exploring, and I want my students to know that option exists. Now I'm going to have Irene show us another posture where additional contact points can be really helpful, so a regression of a very common pose. Irene, when you're ready, release your hands to the ground, frame your front left foot. Slide your left knee back to meet your right. She's going to come to an extended tabletop position. Don't think her alignment's off. I gave her this instruction. She's going to keep her wrists out in front of her shoulders. When Irene is ready, she's going to shift her body forward so her chest is right in between her thumbs. And then she's going to lower just halfway down, a little supported version of Chaturanga Dandasana. She has her knees down on the ground. This is a great way to train in this particular movement, the pushing movement. And Irene, come back up. Can I have you show it one more time? Do you mind? Take a little break. I want to show this because one of the greatest ways to really help our students, remember, move better on the mat so they can move better off the mat, is to give them a place to really work from where that steadiness and comfort can be created. And you see that with the knees down. Go ahead and prop yourself back up, Irene, and you can sit back onto your heels. So I offer that again, another practical application of this information. That's a great way to maybe the first time, or maybe an option you offer over and over again to your students, is to really work on building that movement efficiency from a neuromuscular standpoint, efficiency from alignment and exploration by offering more contact points in a pose. So remember, more contact points, more stability, a regression. When we release our contact points, so if Irene went and lifted her knee up as you saw on the one side and then took that step forward, we had less contact points in that high lunge position. So with all of that being said, how does this all come together and create an inclusive class experience? Well, here's what I'd like to offer to you. I'd like us to look a little bit at what I'll call a blueprint. So I have to say this, there are so many variables in yoga. There are so many styles of yoga. This is not intended to be this is what you do first, second, third, fourth, fifth. I want to give you a blueprint. I look at that in my perspective as a roadmap. I want to give us some considerations, have us ask ourselves the question why. And this particularly applies to vinyasa style classes. So I'm going to right now on the screen, I'm going to pull up what I consider to be a class blueprint. What you will notice as you see all the text coming up on the screen, what you're going to notice is certain things are noted in red and certain things are noted in black. And that was not a typo, I promise. It's intentional. There's always a rhyme or reason. I say there's a method to my madness. Irene's heard this before. She spends a lot of time with me. So let me tell you a little bit about this class sequence. The first place we start, you see it noted in red, we always start our classes in some type of what I call a grounding or centering pose. I'm going to invite Irene. She's going to love this part. Irene, will you come down onto your back? She's going to start in Shavasana. Now that might sound really odd to some of you. Isn't that how we end a class? But I invite you to think about, again, what's the purpose, what's the why? What is my intention behind offering a place for a student to create comfort, steadiness, and support right from the get-go in a class? That could be lying on the back in Shavasana. It could be some variation of this, maybe more support with the knees bent. It could be any other grounding or resting, centering pose that allows students to focus what I feel on not only creating some steadiness in the body, but also steadiness in the mind and openness in the spirit. I want this to be a place where we can focus on things like breathing techniques or pranayama, where I can focus on allowing students to make the transition from the outside world to their mat so they can be really present in the experience. So my encouragement to you as yoga teachers, or maybe those who are teaching in a group fitness setting as well, think about how can you, and this could be something very short depending on the class format you're teaching. If you're teaching a dedicated yoga class, maybe this is the place we spend the first few minutes of a practice. But how can I create right from the get-go what we've heard Krishnamacharya and both Jessica Char talk about, which is really creating that steadiness and comfort through our specific sequencing of poses. This is key. So Irene, starting today, this is just a little kind of preview, little snippets of a class. You're not going to see a whole 60-minute class because I don't have that much time, maybe in the future. But what I want to show is where we start. So we start in a grounding or a centering pose. That's part one. Now, right from here, the next phase of the blueprint, I'll direct your attention back to the screen. The next phase of the blueprint is how do we then start this process of warming and integrating. The integration I think about is what we've just learned about the body. It works as one integrated unit, that kinetic chain. So how do I start to implement that right into my class sequence? So to take Irene from where she is now, I'm going to ask her to inhale and just reach the arms over the head. Just start to create a little bit of movement, lengthen the body from fingers to toes. So we're starting already to start to create some movement in the glenohumeral joint, shoulder joint, just a nice, easy stretch. When she's ready, she's going to exhale, relax the arms down at her sides. Palms are facing into the floor. Slowly, she's going to bend both knees. She'll keep the feet about hip width distance apart, maybe even a hair wider than what she thinks is hip width. And then she'll scoot the heels in nice and close. Now this again, when I show you this as part of this warming, integrating portion of the class, which is happening in the first few minutes of a class, I'm going to show you a pose that you might think is normally just done at the end. But I'm going to show you bridge pose. But notice how Irene's going to do this. She's going to press down through the feet and the hands and lift the hips. She's just going through a small range of motion. And when she's ready, she's going to soften down. She's going to do this 3 more times for me. So what I'm doing here, she's not moving into a deep back bend, as we can use bridge pose to do. What she's doing is she's starting to create mobility in the hips. So she's just simply moving into a hip extension, and she's lowering down. So I can use a pose like this that we normally think, oh, we only do it at the end of class. Well, in fact, depending on the application, it can be used to enhance joint mobility in a key area such as the hips. So that's one pose I can use. Now, to have Irene continue in this warming integration exploration, here's what I'm going to ask her to do. Her arms are already at her side. Irene, taking your time, can you come up to seated? Beautiful. So now she's in a seated position. She's extended the legs, and I'm going to ask her to fold them in, coming into a Sukhasana ED seated pose. So any cross-legged position is fine here, but notice what's happening. Now we're starting to get into some external rotation of the hips. But I want her to be really comfortable. We're just warming the body. She's going to place her hands on the thighs, as she's already done. She's going to do a seated version of cat and cow pose. So she'll notice this gentle arching and rounding of the spine, and she's focusing on what's one of those other 4 key areas of mobility. She's working on creating mobility in the thoracic spine, that upper back. This will be really important in anywhere we go in our yoga practice because it has a functional application to life. But it's especially important if maybe I'm doing something that day, working towards a peak pose or theming or sequencing my class towards a certain outcome or objective. So she's going to finish this last round that she's doing in this seated version of cat and cow pose. Now what she's going to do when she's ready is inhale, sweep the arms up overhead. And then continuing with this theme of warming the body, she's going to exhale, rotate to the right, crossing the left arm to touch the right thigh. So she's just in a gentle seated twist. She won't be here long. It's very subtle. We're working on one of our planes of motion, transverse plane, but she's working again towards more mobility in the thoracic spine. Irene, send both arms back up when you're ready. And then exhale, rotate towards our friends at home or wherever you might be. And she's moving into a twist on the other side. So this is, again, another way from this seated position. Part of this warming integration is to focus on these key areas of mobility. Irene, reach the arms up when you're ready. And then as she exhales, she's going to take her hands down to the ground, and she's going to come into a kneeling position, hands and knees position. So she can roll over. You can come into this different ways. For our purposes, we'll keep it nice and brief. Now, Irene, walk your hands just slightly forward ahead of your shoulders. She has the fingers spread already. When she's ready, she's going to come into downward facing dog. Tucking the toes under, she's going to lift the hips up. And the first time in downward facing dog, I'm going to invite her just to move. I love this is organic movement exploration. So she'll do anything that feels right in her body. Our intention here in this warming integration is to focus on the body as one integrated unit, right? That kinetic chain. Thinking about those key areas of stability and mobility and those primary movement patterns. Now, from this position, here's what Irene is going to do. She's going to slowly bend at the knees and walk the hands back towards her feet. She's back into that forward fold you saw earlier. And so again, we have what? Gravity working at our advantage. So this is the first time in this class, in our mock sequence you're seeing, where she's starting to warm into that back line of energy, into those muscles that run down the backs of the legs. So she's got gravity working at her side. Could she then maybe hold opposite elbow and forearm? We'll see Irene do that now. And maybe just take some light sways. Many people call this ragdoll. Sure. Again, the process here is just gently warming the body. My fitness folks, you think of this as what you do, quote, warming up or a bit of a movement prep. So when Irene's ready, she can release the arms back down. And then nice and slow, she's going to uncurl the spine to rise up to standing. She'll take her time. There's no rush. We got plenty of time, right? We can hang out. And when she's ready, she's going to connect the hands to the hips. Now, what I'm just going to ask her to do now, this is not a yoga pose that has a Sanskrit name or anything particular. I'm just going to ask her to move at her ankles and feet. Lift up one heel, just some ankle circles, clockwise, counterclockwise. It doesn't always have to be so fancy. I promise you this. It just needs to be movement, and it needs to be intentional and thoughtful. So now that she's done a little bit of work for the ankles, feet, maybe we're doing a lot of standing work today. We'll see that coming up soon in our sequence. I want her to be nice and prepped through the feet, the ankles. Build the foundation and work up. So now what she can do, because her hands are already at her hips, I'm going to look for the direction of movement. We're seeing everything come to life. Irene, take a big step forward with your right foot. And then when you're ready, bend both knees, shift the hips forward and down, and then soften the left knee to the ground. Remember you saw Irene do this before? So a couple things are at play at this moment. She has shorter levers. Notice I asked her to take that step forward, not with the arms raised up immediately, though I'm going to ask her to do that in a minute. She has shortened levers. She has a contact point, additional contact point with the knee down. And so she's nice and stable. Remember, that's steadiness and comfort in a pose. Now she's going to move into crescent lunge or low lunge on Janayasana, sending the arms up. I want to add a little bit of movement here. I want this to be a dynamic exploration. I'll talk more about why in just a minute. So she inhales, reaches the arms up. As she exhales, I'll ask her to bend the elbows, take a mini back bend, little hyperextension in the spine, shine the heart as the hips shift forward. Inhale, re-extend the arms just one more time. And then exhale, bend at the elbows and do that gentle shift forward. Lots of dynamic exploration. Now she's going to release the hands down to the ground, and I have to tell you, for our purposes today, she won't do the other side. I promise I would never leave her imbalanced like that. But here's what I want to show, how she could transition if she were to then go do the other side. Irene, when you're ready, slide the right knee back alongside the left. She's back in that extended tabletop position. This is a great way for me to start working into maybe exploring other movements of the spine. Inhale, shift your body forward. Listen to this. Exhale, bend the elbows, keep them close, but lower the body all the way to the ground. Another pose that we might think of as something we normally reserve for the end of class, but it's something we can do here as part of this warming and integration. And that's just a light exploration in cobra pose. So she's going to inhale, lift just the chest off the ground. She's keeping the tops of the feet. She's lifting the knees slightly, and she's going to lower back down. I could have her do this maybe 1-2 more times. Do it one more time for us, Irene. So again, we're exploring the movements of the spine, 6 different movements of the spine. She's exploring them here. It also was a great prep, and as she takes a small break, it was a great prep for her to focus on keeping the elbows close to the body and lowering down with control. That'll set us up with the contact points. The knees were down. A great setup to explore later in our series, which you're going to see, Chaturanga Dandasana, or that 4-limb staff pose. Now, when she's ready, she's going to inhale, press the body up away from the ground, and come back to that extended tabletop. Now, little stability work, because I don't want to talk all mobility and no stability. Tuck your toes under, Irene, and then lift the knees off the ground. She's coming into a high plank position. Let the legs fully extend, and we're focusing on building stability in the lumbar spine. All the musculature of the core is active, working here to maintain this body position. And then exhale, send the hips high, downward facing dog. So as I mentioned, if I were really teaching a class right now, I would not forget about the other side. I know we only showed that low lunge, that little dynamic version on one side, but I would, of course, make sure we transition back through and Irene does it on the other side. But for our purposes now, we're going to keep journeying on in the blueprint. So Irene's going to bend the knees. This time she's looking forward. She'll take a step forward, 1 foot at a time, different ways to get there, same end result. She's at the top of her mat. Nice and slowly, she'll uncurl the spine and rise up to standing. So now I'll direct your attention back to the blueprint. So that was the warming integration, and that plays a key role very similar to what the next bullet point you see, which are sun salutations. Now I have to say this, a sun salutation doesn't have to be done always as the traditional sun salutation. It can be done in a number of different ways. Again, think about, ask your why. What's your purpose? What's the reason? You can add variables, you can remove parts, but the intention behind sun salutations is strategic. Here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to kick Irene off, and then I'll let her cruise through it. Inhale, reach the arms up over the head. As she exhales, she's going to forward fold. She knows this series, and again, my intention is not to teach and break down each pose today. I want to give you the blueprint. So she's going to keep moving. I'm going to keep talking. Why do we do this warming integration that we just spent a bit of time talking about? And why do we do something like any variation of a sun salutation or some sort of dynamic, especially in a vinyasa class? The essence is that breath synchronized movement. Why do we do this? Well, from a functional, a physical standpoint, we do this to start to literally warm the body, to increase core body temperature, to enhance neuromuscular efficiency. We do this to get the body ready for the practice. And Krishnamacharya's teachings were very, very focused on this, that we have to systematically warm the body in order to prepare it to wherever it is we're trying to go. That's intelligent sequencing. And then in his son, who I mentioned already, Desikachar, in his book Heart of Yoga, he talks about the fact that asana, physical poses, should be practiced dynamically before they're practiced statically. And for us in the fitness world, that makes so much sense. So we want to have that dynamic exploration. Irene could do that several times. For our purposes, she just wanted to show us one time through. Thank you for that. Next part of our blueprint, I'm directing you back to the screen. I want to talk standing poses. So standing poses, this makes up a large portion often of our classes. There's so many things we can do from a standing pose perspective. But here's what I'm going to ask Irene to do right now for me. She's already at the top of her mat, as you see here. I'm going to ask her, considering she just went through, say, some sun salutations, I'm going to ask her to come into a pose that we've seen before, Utkatasana, chair pose. So she can actually choose. Now that we know and we've explored it, maybe she decides to keep the feet hip width. Maybe she brings the big toes to touch. Remember, we're talking the base of support. She'll hinge at the hips, bend the knees. So we've seen a single leg pattern. We saw some rotation. We saw some pushing. We're seeing all of our primary movement patterns come to life. So she comes into chair pose. I want to add even a little more movement. Depending on my purpose, I want to add more warming for the shoulders. She's inhaling, reaching the arms up. She's exhaling. She's going to reach the arms back, fingertips towards the back edge of her mat. She'll do that one more time. Inhale, reach the arms up. So again, a little more warming through the shoulders. Exhale, reach the arms back. Inhale, stand all the way up, Irene. Upward salute, reach the arms over the head. And then exhale, draw the hands to the hips. So we've shortened her lever. This is intentional, because if I were really sequencing and teaching a class, I want Irene to move on. So you saw in our warming, we had her move from the back of the mat forward, direction of movement. Now I want to see her move into some of our standing poses from the front of the mat back. She's going to shift the weight to the right foot, little single leg action. She's going to step back with the left foot when she's ready. She's going to come into warrior two. So she's going to get situated. She'll find all the alignment. Again, my intention today, not to teach you alignment of the poses, not to break down each pose, but to talk about how this might come together. So in a vinyasa style class, warrior two, a pose we often explore. Why? Great opportunity to start to work into external rotation of the hips. Really important stuff. So I could make this a little bit of a flow as well, maybe moving, inhaling into warrior two. Irene's going to exhale and move into extended side angle. You saw her do that before. Remember, the things I want to bring up is how do we manipulate the variables? When you're really teaching a class with real life people, what options could you offer? Remember, that hand can come to the hip, shorten the lever. We can introduce blocks. We can invite our students to reach the bottom hand, in this case, the right hand to the ground. Lots of things we can do. And then she's going to inhale to reverse warrior. So I call this little warrior series. It's nothing formal. It's just 3 poses that might connect together and maybe something you're already doing in your classes. But we can connect, again, breath synchronized movements, the essence of a vinyasa practice, and we can go through this series. So I'm going to ask Irene actually to come out of this pose by standing up. She's going to connect her hands back to the hips. She can bring the feet in a little closer together. And then she's actually going to keep the feet wide because I want to talk about some other standing poses that we can do. So in this standing series, and this wasn't intended to show you like what happens first, second, third, just to give you some ideas. Other standing poses we can do, maybe we're moving into some type of a forward fold. So Irene, she's already in the position. Maybe she's moving into wide-legged forward fold, Prasarita Padottanasana. She can simply let the body fold forward. Notice she kept her hands on the hips. That's a great option, more accessible for someone to come into this pose. Could she have done that with the arms wide? Sure. She can do that in a number of different ways. But standing poses, some of our forward folds could absolutely occur in this portion of the class. Irene, when you're ready, go ahead, stand back up for me. She's going to take her time coming back up. To come back to the front of the mat, so say we're in a class where we just did that pose. She's going to turn the right toes forward, pivot on the back left foot, and take a step up. She's practicing those little single leg movement patterns. So cool, huh? She's back up at the top of the mat now, and I want to show other things that happen in this standing portion of a practice. So just very briefly, during this section of the class, remember, this is not sequential right now. Disclaimer, it's not sequential. But what happens in this portion of a class? Irene could come into something like tree pose, Vrikshasana. So we really want to get deeper into single leg. She could come into tree pose. She's going to set up how she prefers to. Again, we could think about those contact points. Could she have the toes on the ground when she did this? Sure. Could she keep the hands on the hips? Have a shorter lever? Sure. She's got her hands at heart. Could she reach the arms over the head? A progression of this pose, increasing the lever length, raising her center of gravity. Absolutely. See how all of this makes sense? So now it's just not like, oh, I know these options. Now I understand the why. And I'm really applying that to my class. She's going to come out of the pose because she knows we don't have a ton of time today. But standing, balancing postures certainly can occur in this portion of the class blueprint. Now I'm actually going to ask Irene to inhale, reach her arms up towards the sky. And then exhale, fold forward. You saw this when she did her sun salutation. Now, the next thing I want to direct your attention back to the screen is she could do in this portion, kind of this segment of the class. We're probably at this point in a realistic class about halfway into a class. Could she start to incorporate some some arm balancing postures or inversion? Sure, depends on what my focus for the class is. So if we did want to have something that was an arm balance, Irene could show maybe an example coming into something like crow pose. She can readjust, get situated, but she could come into an arm balance. Now what's so important for me, and I have to bring this up, is that if we are going to incorporate arm balances and inversions, it's important that we do that in a way that we've systematically prepared our students for. So we don't kind of willy-nilly just throw in arm balances for the sake of doing that. Should have a very intentional focus, and we should have systematically prepared students to do that. So Irene, when you're ready, she can explore the pose however she chooses to. We could use props. We could do a lot of different things, but that's just maybe an arm balance we might choose to explore. She's going to come out of the pose when she's ready. And from here, I'm going to actually invite Irene to come back into that forward fold position. So here's the thing. If I want to incorporate those arm balances versions, I do that. And I make sure I have good core focus somewhere through my class sequence. Because so much of arm balancing is not just upper body strength. It's really the integration of the body. That all centers around the core. That's the essence of our movement. Irene, inhale to a halfway lift. She's going to create a little counterbalance. So this is great. Maybe before or after she did some more standing forward folds. Maybe she did a Padahastasana. Maybe she did big toe pose, some of the things. But maybe we want to create some counterbalance here. We want to use some extension of the spine. So she's inhaled. She's going to exhale, bend at the knees, draw her hands to the ground, and then step one foot back. Step your left foot back for me. I'm going to show this last part of the sequence very briefly, but she's going to, if we were talking now, direct your attention back to the screen. Now that we've really warmed the body as an integrated unit, we could start getting deep into areas like the hips. Now you see the black coloring on the screen, all the text that's in black, that is specifically designed to say these things can interchange, they're optional, they can be moved around, it depends on what you're doing. Irene, bring both hands inside of the right foot for me. And then just let the toes come out a bit. She's going to come into a variation of runner's lunge. She could create more contact points, release the left knee down. She can invite a block in. She could release the elbows, forearms for more depth, exploration. Depends what she wants to do. But I can come into some hip opening postures here. Do hip openers always happen before back bends? I really say it depends what your intention in your class is. So for example, I might have some hip opening, but maybe I'm doing something like a peak pose, a really intense hip opener, like a king pigeon, and that needs a back bending element before I explore that. I need to explore a little bit of hip opening, a little bit of back bending, and I might come back into an intense hip opener. So Irene, for the purposes today, she doesn't get balance. I'm sorry. She's going to come out of the pose. She's going to reframe that front foot. And I want to direct your attention back to the screen right now. Irene's going to step her right foot back just to get situated. The screen shows that this could be a place to come into back bending poses. So Irene has come back onto her mat. We could do things here, and just in the essence of time, she could show things like how we can move into a deeper expression of cobra pose, how we could come into something like floor bow. You saw that in one of my pictures at the beginning of this class today. But for our purposes today, I want to show what she could do to combine what you see as bullet that's labeled as back bends, heart openers, and combine that with a little bit of kneeling work. I want Irene to show, just for a moment, to show Ustrasana camel pose. She's going to come to a high kneeling position. We could always support the knees with a blanket. But Irene's going to take the hands to the lowest part of the back, fingers pointed down, and she's going to work into this heart opening back bending posture. And a great way to do this, I offer this tip to you. She's literally going to trace her gaze right up the side wall and then back along the ceiling. This is working on the mobility we've built all class long through the thoracic spine. And instead of just dropping the sheer weight of the head back and using gravity, which I would consider there, to our disadvantage. Whenever, Irene, you're ready, just start to trace your gaze in reverse. So back bending postures, depending on what we're doing, they could come at this part of the class sequence. Remember, all of the text, go back to the screen, all the text you see in black can be interchanged. It can be moved around. Now, if we've done some type of work, those hip openers, that back bend, before we transition and just end a class, we want to make sure we leave enough time. I want to make sure we do something seated first. Irene, will you come all the way down to a seated position? She can just shift the hips to one side, extend the legs out, and very briefly, she can have the arms at the side, Dandasana staff pose. So a great way to neutralize the spine a bit. So we want to think, avoid querying their extremes, going from deep forward flexion right into deep hyperextension. We want some medium. But before we go all the way onto our back, Irene, slide the hands all the way back behind you, fingers behind the body. She's going to come into a reverse tabletop position, a reverse plank position, or the option for a reverse tabletop. She's going to lift the seat up, draw the feet towards the ground. If I wanted to shorten the lever, I could do that reverse tabletop. She could bend the knees. It's more accessible, more supportive, that steadiness and comfort. But I want to make sure if she's doing a pose like this, I don't have this at the start of my class. She needs to open the shoulders, the chest, and also the hips. Go ahead, take a break for me. My little trick to help students scoot forward, bend your knees, scoot your hips to your heels once, twice. She's coming to the front of her mat. She's going to gently recline onto her back, however she chooses to do that, and I want to direct your attention back to the screen. Final portion of the class is any type of supine poses, and then coming into our final rest. Before we move into Shavasana, we've got to have some supine poses. So I'm just going to show this. I'll give Irene a little bit of time to hang out. Irene, I'm going to have you come into a restorative bridge pose. Go ahead and root the hands, the feet down, lift the hips. You saw her do this in the warming, but I'm going to actually slide a block just for her purposes right underneath that lowest part of her back, right at the sacrum. She's going to rest on top of it. Now I'm going to talk through what we do in these supine poses. This point, the body has been very warm, right? Our class is an arc. It's a curve. We've warmed the body and now we're on the decline. But this is a time where we can, again, help our students create more support. From this pose, I could easily have her come into a bridge pose, no block. She could add in maybe interlacing the hands underneath her. She could come into a full wheel pose, Urdhva Dhanurasana, if I've prepped her to do that. So we have to think about our variables and how do we, again, create these tailor-made experiences while teaching a wide, diverse group of students. Irene even could come into an inversion. This is another place inversions happen. Irene, will you show us how that could look? She could lift one foot, keep the knee bent, then the other. And then she could even come into a supported shoulder stand, a really restorative version, just reach the legs up. She wants to make sure she keeps her ankles, her knees, and her hips in line. So she might need to draw the heels forward just a little bit. So does someone come into a full shoulder stand from here? Sure. All she needs to do is just use her hands to lift the hips off of the block. Go ahead and bend the knees, reverse out of it, and come down. To remove the block and then to just talk very briefly about the end of our class, Irene's going to lift the hips. She'll take the block, just shimmy it off to the side, relax. We could do some other exploratory poses here. We don't have time. I want to make sure I get to your questions, but she could come into things like reclining bound angle pose, happy baby. But for right now, she's going to get a brief second in Shavasana. She's going to extend the legs back out. We came full circle in our practice. Pretty cool, huh? And now she's in her final resting posture. If you go back to the screen, that's the last part of the blueprint. We end somewhere. It could be Shavasana. I'll argue it could be something else. But it should be a place that conveys the same type of focus as what we started our class with, which is how do we create not only that steadiness and comfort in the physical body, but also in the mind. And not to disrupt Irene, because she should get a lot more time than about 30 seconds in Shavasana, but that's all I've got for her, because I know Jackie wants to come out and join me, and I want to get to your questions. Irene, when you're ready, you can come out of the pose, maybe roll to one side. And we have to thank Irene for being here. I'll just assume you're giving her a big round of applause, because inside I am too. She's awesome. Thank you for all of your help, Irene. Appreciate it. And that's the blueprint. I mean, that's just the high-level overview. If you can't tell, Jackie knows this about me. I could spend a lot more time. But Jackie says that we want to take some of your questions. I know she does, and I actually want to, too. So let's talk questions.
We do. Thank you, Jessica. That was great. And thank you to Irene as well. Thanks for joining us, guys. We do have some time for